I'm so excited to pass the floor to our Executive Director and Founder, Nathaniel Stinnett, to get us started for tonight. Nathaniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ren. Thank you to everybody who is here with us tonight. As Ren mentioned, my name is Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And we are all so excited to have you with us tonight. I think you're going to have a lot of fun. I know it's an online fundraiser, but I mean it. I think you're going to have fun. I think you're going to learn a lot. I definitely think you're going to get lots of cool voting data. And for those of you who are new to the Environmental Voter Project, you'll learn a little something about our work. I want to start by thanking people. This is a fundraiser. The voter turnout work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project depends on funds. And you can see a whole bunch of members of our host committee who gave of their time, who invited many of you, and who also gave generously themselves to support our turnout work. And so thank you deeply to all of you. I sincerely hope that all of you take real pride in all of the results that we're able to get at the Environmental Voter Project. Tonight is a 45-minute event. And you'll see I'm going to give a brief presentation. We then have an awesome special keynote speaker, Mayor Michelle Wu of Boston. You're then going to get a behind the scenes look at some of the operations at the Environmental Voter Project. You are then going to be able to choose among 4 states for a 5-minute briefing that I'll give to you, and then we'll close. And then if you'd like to stay, you can stay for an extended Q&A with me afterwards. All right, let's jump into things. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, and this is our annual fundraiser. We are at a very special moment in time, not just for our country, but also for our nonprofit, the Environmental Voter Project. Today, September 13th, is exactly 6 years after the first fundraiser we ever had. It was in the middle of us running our first 1-year proof of concept in Massachusetts. It was in a function room above a restaurant in Faneuil Hall. Maybe some of you were even there, but boy, have we come a long way since then, exactly 6 years ago. We've spoken to now almost 8.7 million unique voters in 17 states. And what is also special about today is that 8 weeks from today are the midterms. 8 weeks from tonight, you'll be watching election returns roll in. And what I hope to show you is a little bit about the last 6 years, but also a little bit about the 8 weeks that are to come. All right, for those of you who are new to the Environmental Voter Project, in a nutshell, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just 2 things. 1, we identify already persuaded environmentalists who don't vote. And then 2, we turn them into better voters. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That also means that we don't endorse candidates, we don't lobby for particular policies, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or other environmental issues. A good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing game. We are solely in the behavior-changing game. We find already persuaded, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who care so deeply about these issues, it's their #1 priority, yet they aren't voting. And then we make a purely behavioral intervention. A good way to think about us is we're like data scientists and behavioral scientists. And the reason we take this really special focus on our work is because one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason, we can't consistently get progressive environmental leadership, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, is that there aren't enough voters who list climate and other environmental issues as their top priority. And I know that's not something that advocacy organizations like to admit, but I don't think we do ourselves any favors by pretending as though the environmental movement has enough power. We don't. We don't have nearly enough power. And as you can see in just this one poll, but I guarantee you this poll is no different from any others. This is a poll that we actually commissioned in July in 4 battleground states: Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Among likely voters, only 4% of them listed climate and the environment as their #1 priority. Now, the good news is that's about twice as big as it was 4 years ago in the last midterm. But the bad news is that is nowhere near where we need it to be. I mean, there are just as many likely voters in the upcoming election who list voter fraud as their top priority as list climate and the environment as their top priority. And yes, we've gotten some great climate wins recently, but it's nowhere near what we need, and it's nowhere near what physics demands. And if we are going to get consistent climate leadership at the federal, state, and local level, we need to have more voters demanding that leadership. Because even when we have great climate leaders, and you're going to hear from one of them soon, boy, does it make their job harder if there aren't a lot of voters demanding that leadership. Politicians have a limited amount of political capital, and they can't just spend it all on something that voters don't care about. Boy, is that hard. Boy, does that require an enormous amount of courage. And I don't think any of us in this meeting want our futures to rely on the courage of thousands of politicians. We want to make it easy for them to lead on climate. So when we look at data like this leads us to what the Environmental Voter Project focuses on. We look at data like this, and we've decided we need to find all of these super environmentalists who aren't voting and turn them into better voters. And the reason is this: because when you do that, when you do the research and look at voter files and build predictive models and do polls, it turns out that there are tens of millions of already registered voters who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their #1 priority. We're not going to go into depth on this aspect of our research in the presentation, but if you're interested in diving into more detail on this during the Q&A, I look forward to having that discussion. But what I can tell you is there are millions, over 10 million in many elections, already registered voters who list climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they don't even bother to cast a ballot. Is that frustrating? Yes. But it is also an enormous opportunity, because we live in a moment in time where it's become increasingly hard to change people's minds about anything, especially around climate. And what these people represent are millions of already registered voters who don't need their minds changed about anything. They are with us. You shake these people awake at night and they scream climate change. They're just not voting. And so what they need is a behavioral intervention. And that's where we come in at the Environmental Voter Project. We take a 3-step process. I'm going to breeze through this, but very quickly. First, we build predictive models on voter files. These are the same tools that sophisticated Senate and gubernatorial campaigns use right now in the campaigns that are going on to individually identify voters on voter files who have a very high likelihood of caring about issue X or issue Y or candidate Z. We identify people who are really likely to list climate as their top priority. Then, whether you vote or not is public record. We can just narrow our focus to these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. That brings us to step 2. We run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, optimizing which messages work best at turning which non-voting environmentalists into super voters. We've got thousands of volunteers who canvass and call and write postcards. We send direct ads and digital ads and direct mail. And all we're focused on is turning them into better voters. And then finally, habit reinforcement. You don't need to do hundreds of randomized control trials and be a behavioral scientist to understand that if you really want to change people's behavior, you can't just parachute in once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you turn non-voters into consistent voters. And so it's not what we do. Instead, we live in our 17 states year-round, using every election, no matter how small, as an important behavioral intervention opportunity. So that the work that we put in teeny little local elections in February ends up making it really easy to turn these voters out in the fall, and eventually just stop talking to them altogether because they're guaranteed to vote. These are the voter contact methods that we use. You'll see we can only canvass about 65% of our contacts, but we have phone numbers for almost 3/4 of them. We have confirmed deliverable mailing addresses for over 80% of them, and we can also match and deliver digital ads to over 80% of them. This is how we communicate with these voters. And I can tell you, our results have been extraordinary. We submit our work, our election-specific work, to randomized control trials. What those allow us to do, they're kind of like the gold standard of behavioral science experiments. What randomized control trials allow us to do is isolate what our sole impact is on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. And as you can see, just last year, in an odd year, we were solely responsible for increasing turnout as much as 4 percentage points over our control group in local elections, and as much as 1.2 percentage points in statewide general elections. And I'd like you to look at that 0.9 down in Georgia. That was for those 2 US Senate runoffs that decided control of the US Senate, where $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion were spent. And little old environmental voter project spending only $550,000 ended up cutting through $1 billion worth of static and seeing that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout almost 1 percentage point among our over 300,000 targets. The second way we measure our impact is over the long term. Over the past 6+ years, we have now communicated with almost 8.7 million unique low propensity environmental voters. And what we know from tracking them in voter files is that over 1,030,000 of them have now become such consistent voters that they have voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and their most recent local election. This is the metric we are most proud of. These are now 1 million super voters. Now, to be clear, this doesn't have the same rigor as the previous metric I gave you, randomized control trials. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization that mobilized voters in 381 different elections last year, an odd year. We're the ones doing the year-round work to turn these non-voters into super voters. We've been getting a lot of great press and attention from a lot of different places for our cutting-edge data science and behavioral science work to turn these non-voters into voters. And very quickly, looking ahead to the next 8 weeks, these are the 17 states we are operating in. We have individually identified 5.8 million unique registered voters who list climate and the environment as their #1 priority, yet they've never voted in a midterm. And here's the state-by-state breakdown. Forgive me, we only have 45 minutes. I'm not going to leave this up for the whole time so that you can read all these numbers. But what I'll say is I'll just focus in on a few of these 17 states. As an example, in Arizona, you'll see, we've identified almost 250,000 already registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. What does that mean? What does that number mean in Arizona? Well, that's so big that it would have equaled 10.5% of all ballots that were cast last time they had a midterm. These are big, big opportunities. And again, these are people whose minds we don't need to change. We just need to deliver this proven behavioral science informed messaging to them to turn them into better voters. And so I really look forward to handing the reins off to our keynote speaker, but before I do that, I just want to put in my first of many asks tonight, and that is to donate to support our work. You will be seeing many times the donation link in the chat tonight. I would like you to click on it. I would like you to donate generously. We have already identified these targets. We have proven results. We've got 8 weeks until Election Day, and 80% of our annual expenditures will happen over those next 8 weeks. We've got 1 million left to raise. We don't need to raise it all tonight, but you're welcome to donate that much if you'd like. We're really, really excited to tell you more about our work. But before we do that, I would like to introduce the star of tonight, and that is Mayor Michelle Wu. Very briefly, I'll just say, when she was elected 10 months ago, The Hill, the DC magazine, The Hill, said that her election heralded in a new age of climate politics. And boy, were they right. They weren't even as right as they thought. And it is such a tremendous honor to have Mayor Wu as our guest speaker tonight. And it is my incredible good fortune to also have her as my mayor. So thank you for joining us, Mayor Wu.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for all of your leadership, all your personal mentorship and advice. And thank you to everyone for your support of this critical effort, not only in places as specific and small as municipal races at the city level, but we see the impact of climate voters getting engaged, as you just heard, in the pivotal, fundamental seats and races that are critical to our democracy right now. I am someone who has always thought of myself as deeply connected to caring about the environment and the climate, right? I grew up in an immigrant household, and maybe in some ways because of that, because my parents didn't speak English for a long time, I spent a lot of time just by myself outdoors and up in trees, playing in wild spaces that I could find. And I remember when I was young and I learned about the concept of endangered species, and that there was a whole government agency that kept track of how various species of animals were doing, endangered, extinct, threatened, etc. Again, before internet, before any of this, I started writing letters to the US Fish and Wildlife Service to request the annual list of how each species was categorized, and I would track and cross-reference year by year. And despite all of that personal care and commitment and interest as a young child in these issues, by the time I got to college, became a grown-up, went out into the world, I didn't think that there was anything that I could individually do anymore about what I was worried about and what I had been so excited by as a child. I went to college, I graduated, got a job in consulting. My mom began to experience symptoms of serious mental illness, and so I stepped in to become her caregiver, raised my sisters, realized that politics and our government systems and healthcare and schools and the many ways that my family was in stress needed to be changed. And so I dove in and ended up winning a seat on the Boston City Council. And even then, I was not reconnected to the sense of having agency and being able to do something about the big issues. It really was after I was serving on the city council and towards the end of my first year on the council, my first son was born. And here I was, a new counselor, a new mom. He was born in December of 2014. And it was right around that year that we started to see the news headlines of hottest year ever recorded. And here I was bringing a new baby into the world at home and trying to process everything and seeing story after story about how the frightening weather events we had experienced as a world and community might be connected to this idea of records being broken. I went and researched how many years of, hundreds of years of record keeping. It was quite scary. And then the next year, when my son turned 1, again, towards the end of that calendar year in December, the record was broken again and again and again. And so in some ways, becoming a mom has really made it so that I can't look away once again and have no patience for comfortable, convenient solutions, because it is our kids and their kids' futures that are at stake. Now, I didn't expect growing up hanging in those trees to ever be in a position where I could help create the momentum and platform to do something about the larger systems and policies. But in Boston, we have had the chance to do exactly that. I'm now approaching my 10-month mark in this new role as mayor, and we have been able to see the needle move already. My first city ordinance that I signed was to divest Boston from fossil fuel investments, among others. We have made moves to electrify our municipal fleet, procured a number of electric school buses among the vanguard, even before the new federal climate legislation will make more of that available. So we're already setting a foundation. We have moved the city to municipal aggregation to up our sourcing of green energy. We're looking at new building codes and standards, and we're in an unprecedented public transit situation right now with one entire subway line, the Orange Line, shut down for major repairs because we've been pushing for urgent solutions. And while that is happening, stood up a whole surface level diversion program in partnership with the MBTA that has created dedicated bus lanes, protected cycling infrastructure, some of which we intend to keep beyond the end of this public transit emergency. And we're seeing that by building a team, by putting climate at the front of every conversation and integrated with every city department's work, we are able to, in just a matter of months, begin to see the glimmer of possibility in how much, even right at the lowest level of government and the municipal level, we can make a difference. And yet, I reflect on how unlikely and impossible everyone had said to me it would be to end up in a role where I could influence climate and where others of my colleagues could be in this role as well. As Nathaniel had shown on those statistics, it is well known in poll after poll after poll that climate tends to rank towards the bottom of what people are bringing into the polling place with them as their top concern. I will point to Boston and Massachusetts as a little bit of a counterpoint. I am determined to make part of our city's brand the fact that we will be the greenest city in America. We will be a city for everyone, family friendly, but climate and our Green New Deal leads every conversation that I have. And I know that I am solid in doing so because that is the platform that I ran on and won a mandate from voters to deliver. And that those voters, we're very lucky to be the birthplace also of the environmental voter project. Those voters have been contacted and communicated with and strengthened over a period of many years to get to this point. We are a city where the advocacy community, the organizing that happens around climate is deeply interconnected. And that has meant that the questionnaires that go out and shape each election cycle for city council, for mayor, for state representative and beyond include many hard questions from climate groups. So the opportunities to help provide the political space for leaders to emerge really start far upstream from just the point of walking into the polling place and seeing who will show up, although that is certainly a key part of it. But the impact that you all have by ensuring that people vote and stay engaged and stay plugged in translate immediately into changing the entire ecosystem of what politics feels like, especially when it's races that are contained and impactful, anywhere from district, state rep and city council districts to a mayoral race. And so cycle after cycle in Boston, we have been seeing the gains build on each other so that now it is no longer up to environmentalists to just step forward and say, I'm going to run for office and I hope you will consider voting for me. And here's everything else that I care about as well, my full platform. it is that candidates who may not have had any introduction to climate issues or in the environment, when they raise their hand to run, are immediately greeted by climate voters who have organized themselves into climate organizations with questionnaires and briefings and surveys to ensure that everyone will be put through a rigorous process and emerge on the other side committed to the right issues, informed on what the policies and priorities are, and then with the mandate to lead as well. And so what you're doing is really ground shaking, not just groundbreaking, but ground shaking, because it is wider than any individual candidate, any personality, any specific policy platform. It is about remaking and reshaping that entire ecosystem. And so we see the fruits of that here in Boston. There's a lot more work that we have to do here, but every single day out in our communities, we're seeing the impacts of that. It grows and the momentum builds. And as we build our connections to make this truly Boston's brand, I hope that we can only further cement how impactful it is and how successful it is for candidates to put themselves forward and present a strong climate platform. But thank you so much for your work on behalf of our residents in Boston, on behalf of all of our kids, their kids to come. There is nothing more important that we could be doing but shaping the foundation for our democracy and for our future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mayor Wu, for all of those inspiring words. I don't know if everyone else does, but I have chills. As a Somerville resident, almost neighbor, I want you all to know that she's not kidding. You can look it up, and I hope you really take that with you, is why this work is so important and continues to be so important. Notice how we keep saying all of you. I know we have so many familiar names on the call today. So many of our volunteers are here. Folks representing our partner organizations are here, and I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about them. My name is Shannon Siegel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the organizing director here at EVP. And I just want to pull behind the curtain a little bit about what it's like to be a volunteer with us or a partner with us. We see ourselves at EVP as part of the very, very wide climate, environmental, and voting justice movements. We're not doing this work alone. We're doing it in partnership with all of these other orgs that you're seeing right now, and many, many more. Some of these groups you'll recognize as big national organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby, Elders Climate Action, 350, and others you'll notice are really local. Maybe you haven't heard of them before, like the Climate and Energy Project in Kansas. We know, just as Mayor Wu was mentioning, just as Nathaniel mentioned, that in order to make this type of change, we need to work with our partners on a national and a local level. And our volunteers understand why that's important. So we have volunteers from across the country, even states where we're not currently doing voter turnout, helping us mobilize voters from home. So these volunteers are finding what we're doing to be effective, impactful. We're communicating well with them. And as Grace said, which is my favorite thing to hear, they cannot recommend EVP enough. That is our best level of success, is when you bring somebody else with you. A couple more of our volunteers have really appreciated the platforms that we use. So we use Hub Dialer to make calls. Many of my volunteers on this call know that very well. As Ren's going to speak to in a moment, we use platforms and choose softwares based on your feedback, based on what you are telling us. So all of the things that you're hearing from our volunteers here on these slides ring true. And I hope that you'll consider volunteering with us as well, sharing your feedback and helping us continue to improve. You're about to hear a little bit more about all of that from my colleague Ren on the organizing team. Take it away, Ren.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. Like Shannon mentioned, my name is Ren. I'm the organizing associate here at EVP. I work with Shannon as well as with our awesome volunteers. Like Shannon mentioned, we value the time and the energy of our volunteer leaders and volunteers. With that, we always report back the results of their phone banking efforts. We always send a follow-up email after our phone bank. As you can see here in the slide, in that email, we share the total number of callers that joined the phone bank, the total dials that we did in that phone bank, the conversations we've made, and the collective minutes we've logged in during that phone bank. As you can see, we also have ways for our volunteers to share their feedback with us. One is via the feedback form, which I'm going to be talking to you about, and the other is during our debrief after our phone banks. There are multiple reasons why EVP is such a great organization, and one of them is our collaborative spirit. In these feedback form, volunteers can specify which voter contact they've participated in, as you can see here in the slides. And they can also put in the events that they have joined, and then there they can share their feedback. Through this feedback form and our communications, we can better ourselves and make sure that we hear from everyone, literally everyone. Here at EVP, we put premium on our collaboration and the time the volunteers share with us. And now I'm gonna pass the floor to Peter, our data and field director.
I appreciate the advancement there. As field and data director, I'm looking forward to the sales portion of my job. Thank you so much, Ren. One of my absolute favorite parts of working with the Environmental Voter Project is our ability to continuously test our work. As I think you know by this point, every time we turn voters out, we can compare that turnout effort to a control universe of voters who've never been contacted. And this allows us to continuously refine our efforts and keep up with the most recent voter contact best practices and turnout strategies. Testing like this is especially important for a group like ours because these best practices and strategies are always changing. And we need, of course, to be able to communicate with voters in the most effective ways possible. Next slide, please. The good news is that you've got access to a whole heap of these results on our website, environmentalvoter.org/results. I don't have enough time to go through all of the great numbers on here, but I encourage folks to visit our website yourselves to peruse these results at your leisure. You'll immediately see our overall mobilization numbers, which are going to tell you, of course, how many folks we've engaged with since we started in 2015. These 17 shaded states that you see are those states that we're currently working to turn voters out in. These states, by the way, represent a population of about half of the country. Next slide, please. Click on a state and you'll see a number of the number of voters in the state that we've communicated with and the year in which we started working there. We also have some recent notable notes from our work in that area. For instance, we just started working in Pennsylvania in the ripe year of 2017. This was for their off-year municipal and statewide elections. Since then, we've communicated with nearly 1.3 million voters in just that state alone. Pennsylvania, by the way, has a statewide primary and general election in every odd year. This means that we get to stay engaged with the entire state throughout the whole of 2023. So when you wake up on November 9th, I sincerely hope that this little factoid is in your mind. Next slide, please. For those of you in school who need a research paper topic, I really do bet that sometime on this part of our website would give you some super original and helpful ideas. This is because in addition to our state-by-state numbers, you can look at all of the Environmental Voter Project studies that we've done, and these provide a wealth of interesting and important insights into voter behavior and beliefs. Finally, we also have every one of our annual reports posted here, and these are terrific deep dives into our voter mobilization efforts over the years. With that, thank you. I'm going to pass things along to our campaign associate, Danielle, who's going to tell you a little bit about the beautiful sausage-making process of EVP's elections research. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Peter. As you mentioned, I'm Danielle Hargett, EVP's campaign associate. And the part of my job that I'm going to be talking about today, one of my favorite parts of my job, is elections research. So next slide, please. A big part of my job is researching upcoming elections, which includes local, state, and federal elections, as well as special elections and runoff elections. And this is across all 17 states that we work in. So to paint a picture, so far in 2022, there have been at least 310 elections in our target states. And when I started this role back in February of this year, I thought, oh, there must be somewhere where all of these elections are listed online. But oh, was I wrong? Every state, county, municipality, and so on has a different way of listing their upcoming elections on their websites. And sometimes they don't add it until the last minute, so I have to routinely check news articles and even call election offices as part of my research. So once we know about the election or an election, I then spend time researching how voters can cast their ballots. And for primaries, I also have to research whether it's an open, closed, or mixed primary so that we make sure we clearly understand who can participate in the election, because not all independents and third-party voters can participate in primary elections. All of these details, again, are not as readily available as you might think. The amount of times I've come across incorrect information on a government website about an election is jarring, to say the least. And not to mention, voting rules changed during the pandemic, and now they've changed again. For example, some states like New Hampshire opened up absentee voting by mail to all, and now 2 years later, those same rules do not apply, and only voters who meet certain requirements can vote by mail. So there's bound to be confusion amongst voters on how they can vote coming out of the pandemic. Oftentimes, these details are explained in pretty confusing ways, and if it's confusing for me, someone who does election research as part of my job, it's definitely going to be confusing for voters. Next slide, please. So this is why we prioritize creating scripts that not only contain the correct information, but that they are written in a clear and accessible way for voters to understand. If you've read through our new polling report mentioned earlier tonight, you might recognize this finding about voter awareness of voting by mail in 4 battleground states. Our poll found that millions of registered voters in these states are unaware that they can request a ballot and then mail it back or return it to a drop box. And fully 1/3 of Georgians do not know they can vote by mail, and 25% of Pennsylvanians are unaware of the option. So this is why it's so important that we communicate voting options with voters. And that's it for me. Thanks so much for everyone for being here. I'm going to pass it back to Nathaniel.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you to all of the EVP staff. Hopefully some of you have now gotten a picture of how amazing this group of people is that I get to work with on a daily basis. We are now at the my favorite part of the evening. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. Maybe the most frightening part of this evening. There is a poll. You get to choose which of these 4 states you would like me to now give a quick 5-minute lightning fast briefing on. So Shannon, I don't know how long you want to let this poll run, but it's up to you.
It's pretty close to a tie at this moment, so we'll give it like 5 more seconds. If you see the poll on your screen, just click one of the options. Right now we're going back and forth between Georgia and Pennsylvania. I'm not a sports watcher, but I feel like this is the excitement that you get. 2 more seconds. Any other responses? All right, very close. But Nathaniel, you are going to be briefing us on Georgia today.
Wow, Georgia. All right, Georgia it is, folks. I'm sorry if any of my childhood friends or family members in Pennsylvania saw that very narrow loss. All right, 5 minutes, quick lightning briefing on Georgia. Here we go. All right. As you'll see, the Environmental Voter Project has identified almost 137,000 registered voters in Georgia who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their #1 priority over all other issues. And boy, are they all clustered right around Atlanta. A little bit more around the university out there. But this is a very urban and suburban community in Georgia. Now, what does that 137,000 number mean in Georgia? Well, 3.9 million ballots were cast in the 2018 midterms in Georgia. So our target population that we're going after over the next 8 weeks is so large that it would equal 3.5% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm election in Georgia. We've got some tight federal races that are listed there. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on those in a second. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the demographic down of our target population. You'll see here at the bottom, we're comparing our targets, which are registered voters, but our targets, to a baseline of all registered voters in the states. And you'll see in Georgia, what, 76, 77% of our target universe is under the age of 35. That is very, very, very young. Perhaps not, that's not surprising to you, but it's still very, very young. We see a pretty significant gender gap, but actually one that's not as large as we see in many other states. So in pretty much every one of our states, women are much more likely than men to list climate and the environment as a top priority. In Georgia, it's not as strong a gender gap. One word about the terminology I'm using the common parlance gender gap, but just so you know, these demographic monikers that I'm using are what we get from voter files. This is actually sex breakdown information because voter files don't have gender breakdown information, and also the racial demographic titles that I use are taken from the voter file as well. You'll see our target population in Georgia is disproportionately people of color, but that is not coming from Black voters. It is coming almost completely from a disproportionately large population of Hispanic and AAPI voters. This also is something that we see in a lot of EVP states. Not only are we seeing it, Pew Research is seeing it, Yale Program on Climate Change Communications is seeing it. When we look at modern environmentalists, they are much more likely to be Hispanic or Asian American Pacific Islander than white. All right, when we look at the congressional map in Georgia, Georgia has 14 congressional districts. I have listed the 8 most competitive here. Now, as you'll see, pretty quickly, they get really uncompetitive. And I haven't even put down the 6 least competitive districts here. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, boy, has Georgia been gerrymandered really, really badly. Really the only close district or competitive district that we think is going to be Sanford Bishop's district down here. There happen to not be many EVP targets in that district, but when we get into Lucy McBath's up here, the 7th, there are a whole bunch of EVP targets. Rick Allen's, Buddy Carter's, we have a little bit less. Georgia is really, really heavily gerrymandered. So a lot of the action is going to be in the Senate and gubernatorial races. When we polled Georgia just in July, Raphael Warnock was up 5 points among likely voters, and he was up, 26 points among unlikely voters. That is huge. You've probably heard me talk a lot, and other people at EVP talk a lot about how environmentalists aren't voting. Well, look, not only are environmentalists not voting, but in Georgia, it seems like a lot of people who are likely to support Democratic candidates are less likely to vote. When we look at the gubernatorial race, Stacey Abrams was down 8 points. Although this poll was taken in July, I can tell you this has not changed. Stacey Abrams is running pretty consistently behind the Senate race, behind Raphael Warnock. But again, if you look at unlikely voters, that completely flips. Instead of Stacey Abrams being down 8 points like she is with likely voters, she is up 12 points among unlikely voters. Now you'll see if you look at the yellow stuff in the middle, yeah, there are some undecided voters when I toggle back and forth, but not many. And so especially if you're Stacey Abrams' campaign, you're looking at those unlikely voters right now and seeing that as your path to victory. All right, the last thing I just want to say about Georgia, I said this would be a 5-minute briefing. Maybe it's a 6-minute briefing. We asked people in all 4 of these states how complicated they thought voting laws were. Now, one way of looking at this chart might be, okay, got 60 to 70% of voters who say, voting's not that complicated. I'm not sure that's the best way to read this data. First, we are only polling registered voters. So yeah, I would hope that 70% of them thought it wasn't that complicated. But two, look, in so many of these states, 20 to 30% of registered, not unregistered, but registered voters say that voting is complicated. And I bring it up in the context of Georgia because, boy, does that break down pretty awfully along racial lines. You can see only 4% of white voters in Georgia think that voting is very complicated, whereas almost 3 times as many, 11% of Black voters think it's very complicated. And a whopping 37% of Black voters in Georgia think it's either very complicated or fairly complicated to vote. And again, this is only a poll of already registered voters. This tells you that voter suppression is not only alive and well in Georgia, not only is it targeting people of color, but people of color feel it. They are aware of it, even the registered voters. All right. We have to raise another $105,000 in our Georgia budget over the next 8 weeks. So all of you who just picked Georgia in that poll because you wanted a lightning fast state-specific briefing on it, please click that donate link in the chat. We've got a lot of money to raise in Georgia, $105,000 over the next 8 weeks, 56 days to get this money in and out the door. All right. We're going to close this event. We've got another 2 or 3 minutes. And I just want to thank all of you again for spending time with us this evening. As I mentioned earlier, we have already identified 5.8 million of these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. And I ask you right now, click on that chat icon at the bottom of your screen, find the URL to donate and click it so it's open and make a donation. Make a generous donation. I am not asking a favor of you. I am not asking for charity. I am asking you to do something that you want to do. Almost by definition, you are here because you care deeply about the climate crisis, you care deeply about the democracy crisis, and you want the environmentalists we target to show up and vote. But we've got $1 million left to raise over the next 56 days, and we have a goal for this event of $300,000. And although we've got tons of amazing volunteers, it even takes money to train and deploy and get phone bank time and get canvassing literature for our volunteers, not to mention our direct mail and digital ads. We are close to hitting our $300,000 goal for this event, but we've still got to raise $75,695 for this event. That's what's in our budget, and we need to hit it so that we can place orders for millions of direct mail pieces and hundreds of millions of digital ad impressions. And those orders are being placed over the next week or 2. So again, please click on that link, make a generous donation. And finally, I'll just say, thank you, thank you, thank you for being part of our work. For those of you who have been with the Environmental Voter Project since that evening in an attic above a restaurant 6 years ago, boy, have we come a long way. We're now in 17 states. We've helped turn 1,030,000 non-voters into super voters. But if we want to keep doing this work over the next 8 weeks, I'd like you to click on that link and make a generous donation now. That is the end of our scheduled portion of this event. If you would like to stick around, we are going to take a 90-second break so you can type all of those zeros on the end of your really big donations and hit enter. And then if you would like to stay for an extended Q&A session, I would love to have you join us and ask all the questions that we couldn't get to in the chat or I couldn't get to in the presentation. But thank you all for coming, and please do make those donations.
Thank you all so much for joining. As Nathaniel just mentioned, if you have already sent in your donation, feel free to send your questions in the Q&A box for us to get started with in just a moment. I see many, many more coming in. If you asked one earlier and we told you we'd get to it in the Q&A, we will. I have my sheet right here of questions ready. So again, after you've made your donation, please feel free to send a question into the Q&A here. All right, Nathaniel, we got some tough questions. Are you ready?
Now I'm ready. I was muted. Okay, now I'm ready. Yes, I am.
All right, first one that a couple people asked in a few different ways. You mentioned that we measure our results. Can you talk a little bit more about how we do that, what that means, and kind of some context for those measurements?
Absolutely. And thank you to those of you who asked this question. Because we wanted to keep the formal part of this event short, we breezed past this very, very important thing. So you've probably heard me say now a few times the word randomized control trials, or the phrase. You heard Peter say it. This is how we measure our results. Let's say we've identified 1 million super environmentalists in the state of Florida who, based off their public voting histories, we know are unlikely to vote in the upcoming midterm. What we do not do is immediately start communicating with all 1 million of them. Instead, before we talk to a single one of those 1 million low propensity environmental voters, we randomly separate them into 2 different groups. One of them is called a control group. Usually about 15% are put aside in the control group. And the remaining 85% are in what's called a treatment group. These low propensity environmental voters over here in the control group, we never talk to them, never. The remaining 85%, those are the ones we canvass and call and send postcards and direct mail and digital ads to, all with tested, proven, behavioral science informed messaging, just optimized to get these people to vote. Then the election happens. Unfortunately, we still don't know how we've done, but after about a month or 2 after the election, public voter files are updated, because who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. And at that point in time, we can see how many people voted in our control group and compare it to how many people voted in our treatment group. And what that allows us to do is isolate our own impact on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because let's say our control group of low propensity environmental voters voted at 10% turnout, but our treatment group voted at 12% turnout. Well, it doesn't matter if the Biden campaign spent $2 billion in Florida. We've controlled for that. Unless they hacked into our system and only spoke to people in our treatment group, we have controlled for that. Similarly, if it rained in Miami and that depresses turnout, well, there are just as many Miamians as in our control group as in our treatment group. So what these randomized control trials allow us to do is not only measure not just how much turnout increased among environmentalists, but how much we, EVP, were solely responsible for increasing turnout. And then the final thing I'll just say is, it not only allows us to measure our results, it allows us to get at a lot of the stuff that Peter was mentioning earlier. We can test and experiment with different messages to different subgroups of our target population and figure out, okay, message A works best with Black teenagers. Message B works best with Latina grandmothers, but only over direct mail. And we can figure out which messages to optimize and send to which subgroups of our populations. So that's what we mean when we say randomized control trials. And that's why it's so important to us in our ability to prove what we can do.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Another question, of our 17 states, where do you think we can have the biggest impact in the midterms?
Wow. All right. You're asking me to choose between my children here. All right, I'm going to choose 2 states. How about that? That's not too much of a cop-out. Pennsylvania and Nevada. But boy, are there some others. Like, New York is sneaky. A lot of people don't realize how important New York is. I encourage all of you to go to our YouTube page and see some of the deep dives that we've done on particular states there, and you can see how high impact a lot of these states are. But let me just talk about Nevada and Pennsylvania. First, Nevada. Maybe what is shaping up to be the closest US Senate race in the country. Maybe what is shaping up to be the closest gubernatorial race in the country. And 3 out of their 4 congressional districts are super competitive. That means that every single person who casts a ballot in Nevada is voting on both a tight US Senate and tight gubernatorial race. And 3 out of every 4 of them are also voting on a tight congressional race. So just Nevada is going to be crucially important. Moreover, we've identified, I believe it's 98,000 super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote in Nevada. That number is so large that it is equal to 10% of all ballots that were cast back in 2018 when Nevada had a midterm election. So, oh my gosh, is Nevada important this cycle? Oh my gosh, can EVP have a big difference there, make a big difference there? And then the third thing is Nevada, starting, I believe, only about 2 years ago, now mails ballots to all registered voters, similar to what happens in Colorado and Oregon and a few other states. What that also does is it dramatically expands the duration of election day for a dramatically larger segment of the population. So we have almost an evergreen opportunity to turn non-voters into voters for like the last 3.5 weeks leading up to the election. That's Nevada. Pennsylvania, also a tight US Senate, also a tight gubernatorial, 4 tight congressional races. Also, both the state House and the state Senate are fairly tight. And we've identified 700,000 low propensity environmental voters in Pennsylvania. That would equal over 14% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm in Pennsylvania. That is huge. Moreover, just like Nevada, although Pennsylvania doesn't mail ballots to every registered voter, although boy, do I wish they did, what they do have is the ability for people to go usually to their county election office and what's called and request an absentee ballot, fill it out right there and turn it in. Is that kind of a pain in the butt? Yeah, it is, but it starts really soon. In many counties in Pennsylvania, that's going to start in a week or a week and a half. So talk about a really, really extended election day in Pennsylvania. So I would say those are the 2 states that are not only important, but EVP can make an impact and our interventions can make an impact.
Amazing. And although I had very applicable things to send in the chat as you were speaking, Nathaniel, I promise that was a real question asked by a real person on this call. I did not set it up. The answer just lined up with what we're already doing. Amazing. So a bunch of people have asked Nathaniel, you mentioned on that slide all of our different types of voter contact methods. Can you talk a little bit about which ones are more effective than others or which ones we might choose over others?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to actually expand this a little bit and talk not just about effectiveness, but also efficiency, because those are the 2 axes on which we like to measure our impact. And just so I can explain what I mean by that. By effectiveness, I mean which interventions have the highest ceiling, which interventions can increase turnout the most, either per dollar spent or per volunteer hour spent. By efficiency, effectiveness is just which can increase turnout the most. By efficiency, I mean, how much does it cost to get that increase in turnout? Or how many volunteer hours does it take to get that increase in turnout? So sometimes something that's really efficient has kind of a low ceiling for turnout and vice versa. So let me talk about effectiveness. The single most effective, so the turnout method that can increase turnout the most is still one human being talking to another human being in person at their door. So door-to-door canvassing remains the single most effective voter turnout intervention. Depending on the election, let's just take a high turnout midterm election, an effective canvassing campaign might be able to increase turnout as much as 2.5 percentage points over the control group. But it takes a long time. You know, a volunteer in a 2-hour shift might be able to knock on 40 or 50 doors. And maybe if they have an awesome contact rate, they'll have 12 or 13 conversations. And so it's not always efficient. The most efficient way to increase turnout is usually a combination of phone calls and digital ads. But boy, is the ceiling low on how much that can increase turnout. Now they can still do it. They can still do it. And it's very, very efficient, but the ceiling is low. The golden middle is direct mail. I know everybody's like, seriously? Is this like the 1970s? Yes, direct mail is both very effective and pretty efficient per dollar spent. Now, we need to be really careful about what is said in that direct mail, not only the direct mail that we send from the Environmental Voter Project, but for any of you who have done postcards with us, you'll know that boy, does the Environmental Voter Project do postcards very differently from pretty much anyone else. We do not let you design whatever postcard you want. We do not let you write whatever you want on your postcard. We do not let you send it, whatever you want to send it. We have run really rigorous experiments that have told us this is what you need to say. This is the design. This is when you want that postcard to land. But when we can do that, direct mail is in that golden middle. The final thing I'll just say is none of this stuff is duplicative. It is all additive and cumulative. We want to be able to hit voters with multiple different types of interventions because almost always that will increase that overall ceiling. And I know everybody doesn't want to duplicate efforts and they're always worried about the same voters getting things from different groups. No. I guarantee you we've never reached a point in politics where, you know what, we've spoken to voters enough, we should just stop. We're very aware of when we reach our point of diminishing returns at the Environmental Voter Project because we run so many randomized control trials. We ain't gonna hit that point this year. And I don't think anybody is. We gotta keep sending postcards and making calls and knocking on doors, doing digital ads and direct mail all the way through the finish line.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And as you all have seen in the chat, we have links for you to sign up and actually start doing all of that with us. All right, great question from one of our folks on the call. What happens if we raise more than $1 million between now and Election Day? What are we gonna do with it?
Outstanding. So we have a budget that can go up to, I think it's now $6.1 million. It used to be higher than that. So currently we have a $3.5 million budget. We can still efficiently spend as much as $6.1 million without reaching that point of diminishing returns. How are we able to do that? Well, we've already digitally matched all of the people we want to send digital ads to. Now, we're not currently planning in our budget to do full, exhaustive digital ad campaigns to, say, everybody in Maine, even though they got an important gubernatorial, important state Senate races, and an important congressional race. But we are ready to bump up that spend immediately. You want to know how easy it is for me to ramp up our digital ad budget? I type an extra 0 and I hit return. That's it. That's how easy it is. And so we still have a huge, huge ceiling. Take Texas. We currently aren't planning to send serious direct mail to most of our population, most of our target population, which I believe is over 630,000 registered voters in Texas. We're not planning to send much direct mail to them. We're only planning to send a little bit of it. But we have the designs, we have the voters identified, we can send this stuff off even if we get above that $3.5 million budget. Now that 6.1 million number goes down, goes down, goes down the closer we get to election day. But even in the 3 or 4, well, I'd say even like the 2 days, 3 days before election day, we can still add to our digital ad buys. We're going to be able to add money to our digital ad buys up through the Monday, the day before election day. Now, we're not going to have a bunch of extra space in our budget by then, but if you guys want to give us the problem of raising more than $1 million, I guarantee you we are up to the challenge. And I should remind you, there is no limit on what you can donate to the Environmental Voter Project.
Fantastic. All right, we got a lot of questions, so moving right along. Why don't environmentalists vote, Nathaniel?
Oh, yeah.
I'm waiting for an answer here.
Yeah, very good question. So first, let me give you the honest but probably disappointing response to this question before I get into maybe the more interesting part. We don't really know. We don't really know. It's not for lack of researching it, but any social scientist, whether they're a behavioral psychologist or some other part of the field, any social scientist will tell you it's pretty easy to set up an experiment that helps you figure out how to get somebody to do something. Social scientists are really good at that. What they're not good at is figuring out why doesn't somebody do something. That's a lot harder to measure. Really, the only thing we can do is ask them. When you want to know why somebody isn't doing something like voting, really all you can do is ask them. And when you ask people why they don't vote, which is something that society views as a good and important thing, they lie their pants off. And it's really hard to get accurate responses. There are so many what's called survey biases, response biases or non-response biases, where people start telling you what they think you want to hear, what they think the socially acceptable answer is for why they're not voting. And if you want to do a deep dive on this, you can go to the reports and studies tab on our website and view a study that we did, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, called something like, why do voters lie, or something like that. And you can see how prevalent it is that people lie about why they do and why they don't vote. All right, so that's the short, frustrating answer, which is just, we don't know. And anybody who tells you that they know why someone doesn't vote is probably being a little bit sloppy. But here is what we do know. First, as you saw a little bit in that deep dive that I did on the demographics in Georgia of our target population, you can see that people who care deeply about climate and the environment these days are more likely to be young, they're more likely to be people of color, and what wasn't in that briefing is they're more likely to be lower income. What do those 3 demographic groups have in common? Young people, poor people, and people of color. Not only do they vote less often than the average population, but they are almost always, in fact, exclusively, the object of voter suppression campaigns. If anybody anywhere is trying to make it hard for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting either people of color, young people, or poor people, or all 3 of them at the same time. And that strikes at the heart of the modern environmental movement. And so part of what we're seeing here is a mere demographic correlation. People who tend to care deeply about climate and the environment happen to come from demographic groups that vote less often. But that's only part of the story. Because the really interesting thing is when we drill down into those single demographic groups, like if we look only at Latinx voters, the ones who care deeply about climate and the environment still vote less often than other Latinx voters. And if we look only at young voters, the ones who care deeply about climate and the environment, still vote less often than other young voters. So the demographics can't explain everything. What we think is going on there, but again, I want to stress the word think, because this is very hard to prove, is that for more than a generation, the environmental movement has been oddly apolitical. And I imagine many of you are getting your hackles up a little bit at hearing me saying that, so let me explain what I mean by that. Growing up, I certainly felt, and maybe many of you did, that the way you had an impact as an environmentalist was give a hoot, don't pollute, pick up your litter, recycle, maybe change what you eat, change the electricity you consume, change how you get to work. All of which are very impactful, but boy, are they like weirdly apolitical. I mean, you would never hear an NRA member talk like that. You would never hear someone who cares deeply about reproductive rights talk like that. But we in the environmental movement have been conditioned to think of environmental impact as being completely about personal behavior and not about systemic political change. And that's not by accident. The fossil fuel industry has spent hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars over decades trying to convince us to not pay attention to the coal-fired power plant back there, but instead look at ourselves in the mirror and it's all our fault for having a plastic water bottle, which is of course totally ludicrous, but we bought it. We bought it. And I can't help but think that's a lot of what has made up this apolitical nature of the environmental movement and this tendency for us to not be politically engaged, even when we're spending an enormous amount of time doing things because we care deeply about the environment. We think that's what's going on. But again, I want to stress, it's really hard to know for sure.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more, maybe two.
Okay.
I'm choosing between some. How do we know who our voters will or won't vote for? How can we trust that they're going to vote for the climate candidate?
Great question. So perhaps this goes without saying, but I'm still going to say it anyway. No one ever knows who anybody votes for. You volunteer for a campaign and you're calling through a list and you're getting those people to vote and they say, oh yeah, I'm going to vote for candidate X. You don't know. Who you vote for is secret. Who you vote for is secret. I still remember reading about, I believe it was in 2018, a rally that Donald Trump had along the Texas-Mexico border, where 47%, I believe the number was, of the attendees were registered Democrats. You don't know who people vote for. You don't know who people support. But this is what we do know. First, we aren't just identifying people based on what letter is next to their name, nor are we identifying people based on whether they care about climate and the environment. No, we are identifying people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it is quite literally their number one most important political priority over all others. Can I tell you we know who they vote for every time they go into the polling place? No. Again, nobody can tell you that. But what I can say is that these are people who, like you, shake them awake at night and they are going to scream climate change. This is their number one priority. The second thing I can say is this. The last two elections that were large enough to have exit polling data, so we're talking about the Virginia gubernatorial election in November of 2021 and the presidential elections in November of 2020. They asked questions asking people what their number one most important issue was. And when you looked at people who listed climate as their number one most important issue, those people broke harder for Democrats than any other issue constituency group there was. We are a nonpartisan organization. I can never, nor will I ever claim to you that we know who our people are voting for. But again, what we do know is when they vote, they are thinking climate. And if I could just add one more thing, I will say this. Of course, it's important who wins and loses elections. I come from a career in politics. Believe me, I know that. But what is also important is when policy is made. And policy is not made on election day. It's made in the intervening weeks and months and years between election days. And what drives policy making then, even when we elect the so-called right people, is who has a history of showing up and voting. Because those are the people who politicians poll. And I mentioned it once earlier, but I'm going to mention it again. Whether you vote or not is public record. And take it from someone who's run dozens of campaigns. When you can look up by name and street address who's going to cast a ballot in your election and who isn't, who do you think campaigns poll? And who do you think they ignore? I'm sorry, but politicians do not care about the priorities of non-voters. And again, not to get creepy, but they literally know who those non-voters are by name and street address, and they know who the voters are by name and street address. And so, yeah, I feel really good about the decisions that our voters are going to make when they walk into the polling place every time that there's an election. But even if they write their dog's name on the ballot, what I still feel good about is that they are now becoming consistent voters. And those are the people who drive policymaking. Because no politician has ever looked at what non-voters think and said, oh yeah, let's do that instead. I promise you that doesn't happen. We need to flood the electorate with these super environmentalists, because then not only will we elect the right people, but then those people will also be able to spend the political capital to lead on climate.
All right. If you're willing to answer one more, Nathaniel, we've got one more
Absolutely.
sent in by a couple folks.
I said extended Q&A, so we
Yes.
got to make it extended. Let's extend
They're
it.
staying on the line for it. Obviously, we're in a bunch of really important states. We're also not in a couple big ticket states that a lot of folks are paying attention to. Can you just elaborate a little bit on why we're not in some states, for example, Wisconsin?
Absolutely. And for those of you who want to see a map of what states that we are in, it's at environmentalvoter.org/results, and you can see the map of our 17 states. We choose our states based off the following criteria. First, where is there a disproportionately large population of non-voting environmentalists? We need that. We need a big fat denominator, or it kind of doesn't matter how good we are at turning non-voters into voters. If there are 20 non-voting environmentalists in Idaho, like, does it really matter if we turn them all into voters? No, like, that's not going to move the dial on any policy. So we want to go into states where there are tons of these non-voting environmentalists. That happens to be part of the reason that we are not in Wisconsin. No one would claim that Wisconsin is a politically unimportant state. I just want to be really honest with you that you should support other groups if you want to make an impact in Wisconsin. We can't have the biggest impact there. But in states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia, holy moly, can we have an enormous impact. So that's the first criteria we use. Where are there disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists? The second criteria we use is the frequency of their elections. There are many states that no longer hold odd year elections. So for good government purposes, they've decided, you know what, let's have our municipal elections coincide with these really high turnout midterms and presidential elections. There are good like public policy reasons for doing that. You get more people voting for city council and mayor. But that's bad for us at the Environmental Voter Project because we get fewer bites at the apple. I am extraordinarily proud of the research that we do and the findings that we glean from our randomized control trials. I think we're really good at the behavioral science of figuring out what messages turn non-voters into voters. But the truth is, no matter how smart we are, our stubbornness is even more important. our repetition is even more important. And in states like Oregon, there are no odd year elections. And if we can only talk to these non-voting environmentalists twice every 2 years, that is not nearly as good as, say, Georgia, where like every like library trustee primary election goes to a runoff. Like every Georgian has like 8 to 10 elections every year. And so that's really, really important to us as well. And then finally, the third criteria we use is, remember, we work year round. We are not just interested in moving the dial on federal policymaking, but also state and local policymaking. And so you'll see on the map, most of our states happen to be purple states, but there are also some red states like Alaska and Kansas and Texas. There are some blue states like New York and Massachusetts, because those are states where there are still significant policy opportunities. I mean, I would suggest to you that the governor of New York State and the mayor of New York City, I mean, those are two of maybe the most powerful policy-making positions when it comes to climate on the entire planet. Those really matter. And not for nothing, there are 9 competitive congressional races in New York this year. And Massachusetts, dark blue Massachusetts, you might think, oh, why do you work there? Well, so that amazing climate champions can become mayor, like the one you just met, with tweaks to zoning codes and building codes and traffic regulations. You can save the world as an enlightened climate leading mayor. And that is also enormously important to us. So yes, we are not in some important states, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin. It's on purpose. We don't think we can make as big a difference there, but we can make an enormous difference in those other states. All right. I can't believe that so many of you are still on for this very extended Q&A. Thank you for joining us. I just want to close by saying this. It is 9:23 on the East Coast, 6:23 on the West Coast. We maybe even have Alaskans with us. We love our Alaskans. Alaska is one of our states. It is 5:23 Alaska time. 8 weeks from now, you will be sitting down to watch election returns roll in. You are here tonight because you care about what will happen 8 weeks from now when you see those election returns roll in. You are here tonight because you care about addressing the climate crisis, you care about addressing the democracy crisis, and you really care about these upcoming elections. And so please, for the last time, I will say, click on that donation link. It is in the chat. I encourage you to click on the URL right now. We've all been on a bunch of Zoom calls, right? So we all know what happens when we end the Zoom webinar. It's going to close and you're going to say, oh my gosh, where was that URL that I was supposed to click on? And so just click on it now so that it's open. And please give generously. Not for me, not for our nonprofit, but for you. You care deeply about this stuff. We know who our targets are. We've got now almost 200 randomized control trials over the last 6 years telling us which messages work best at turning these non-voters into voters. And now we just need the money to deploy all of these resources. So please help us make it happen. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. Thank you so much to our staff, to our volunteers, to our board members, to all of the new people who are learning about the Environmental Voter Project for the first time. And perhaps most importantly, all of our host committee members and all of the people who were with us 6 years ago tonight at our very first fundraiser. Boy, have we come a long way. And boy, do I hope we've made you proud and that we make you even more proud 8 weeks from today. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.